I think that a lot of people right now are just so horrified, hearing President Biden say without Israel, there's not a Jew in the world who is safe, and then like shipping them a whole nother set of weapons.
Doubling down, tripling, quadrupling down. I mean,
Yeah.
he is so, it's so funny how we saw the most Trumpian version of Biden in this last 10 months, especially around Israel. Like, oh, this is the issue you will not budge from. These are the clearly, I think, anti-Semitic things that you were saying, that Jews aren't safe in this country, that you're just doubling down on. You get asked about, you double down on it.
Yeah, I mean, what a complete abdication of responsibility. Back to the thing like Eliza was saying before, like the American president should believe, that we're safe because he's fighting to keep us safe in this country, right? Outsourcing our safety to a country across the world. Like, what the hell is that?
That's like a big message about Israel, like throughout the Jewish community, is it not? That like without Israel, no one is safe, that they'll come and save you wherever you are, which I feel like would make me feel less safe if I was like, oh, Americans are all safe because Americans going to take care of them, except the Jewish people. We're outsourced to Israel. Like, yeah, that seems like I feel like I want to be under the umbrella of the country that I'm living in.
Yeah, I mean, Lily Greenberg Call, who was the first Jewish resignee from the Biden administration, wrote really beautifully in her resignation letter how much it scares, and she said this in a lot of interviews, how terrifying it is to see the American president make Jews the face of the U.S. war machine.
Yes.
Right?
Oh.
And
that part was so chilling. That part was so real. Sorry, keep going, Simone.
No, and I just think, I mean, this is also in some ways the message of the film Israelism, right? Which is that like many of us were raised with a story. And I think part of the reason that this film is so resonant right now is because actually President Biden's narrative about Israel is very similar to this narrative, right? Many of us were raised, so it like there is a political significance to like unpacking and dismantling this narrative. It's not just like a narcissistic exercise in my own like identity crisis. But, I mean, many of us are raised with this story that keeping Israel strong is the only way to ensure that Jews around the world are safe. And I think right now we are seeing, like, first of all, Israel is the least safe place in the world to be a Jew right now, right? Second of all, the idea that to have safety for one group of people requires the complete annihilation of another, the dismantling and destruction of an entire society. And then third of all, then to say that anybody around the world who is part of that identity group then also has to be complicit in this campaign of destruction and annihilation, also then doubly endangers Jews around the world by lumping us in with this entity that is committing genocide.
Yeah.
And I have to say that obviously on a moral level, I'm so opposed to it. I'm like horrified every single day. I do feel implicated by what is happening in Gaza. And I also feel endangered by the idea that that somebody is doing that for me. I'm outraged by it, but I'm also terrified by it.
Absolutely, because blowback is a real fucking thing.
Yeah,
because
it is.
And you're just like, this is the worst path we could be going on.
That's been really, really just fundamentally confusing, because I feel like I am very, very anti-war, and I can be very confident about that for that, like in those perimeters. But as far as a lot of the other cultural and political issues between Israel and Palestine, or Israel and American Jews, or I feel like I can't lead that conversation. And so I'm trying to listen, and it's so much of it doesn't make sense when people say this, I want this war to stop. I want a ceasefire. And the response has been, well, but we're worried about anti-Semitism in America. And It's like, feels like not stopping this war is helping anti-Semitism in America.
Right.
Exactly. I don't understand how keeping it going is supposed to stop that. It seems like it's shining a really scary light on people.
Yeah.
I mean, I think part of the like narrative of anti-Semitism that I can say like was very much the narrative I was raised on, and I think this is the kind of dominant pro-Israel narrative of anti-Semitism, is that it's just this eternal virus. It's in the water. It's everywhere. There's nothing we can do to understand it. There's nothing we can do to stop it. It's just always going to be around, and the only solution is just to fight because it's a totally irrational, unstoppable force. And so that is the mentality that then leads, you know, this whole group of people to support like this campaign in Gaza. And I think that, and to like be so unquestioning in their support of it, because they're like, the only thing we can do is keep fighting without,
Yes.
you know, I think even this is why there was such a
Like they're going to hate us no matter what. We just have to stop them from
Which is
killing us while they're
anti-Semitic
hating
in and
us.
of itself.
they're always going to hate us. They're always going to try to kill us. This is why the idea that there was a context behind October 7th, this is why people find that idea so offensive, because like,
It's saying that anti-Semitism is a relevant context instead of just a terrible thing.
yeah,
That's what they find upsetting.
it's saying that like there are no structural conditions in the world that could
Right.
you could possibly
Yeah.
try to understand. There's nothing you could do about it, you know. So you have no accountability. You can
Which is
just
also
keep doing
sort of
what you're
saying,
doing.
which is also sort of saying Jewish people are you're doomed. You're doomed no
Yeah.
matter what.
Yeah,
Well,
I
I
think it
think-
is. I think it is at this point. Like, I think it is fair to say that it is a like a doomer. What's the like
Doomer
it is-
boomers.
It's like it is a kind of like apocalyptic worldview that people are being offered, right? That
Yeah.
like the only thing ahead is living and dying by the sword.
And always offered by the people who don't actually have to be the ones murdering people or getting murdered.
Sure. I mean, Christian Zionists are really good at that. I just wanted to jump in. No big deal. No, okay. I appreciate this. I think that to me, what stands out is how actually anti-Semitic the idea that anti-Semitism can never go away is.
Yeah.
That like that is so awful. If someone ever said that about my identity, about like, you know, women are always just fucking psychotic and hysterical. They should go live on Female Island because no one's going to want them. They're disgusting, actually.
Or even if they're not,
get rid of that. Like,
even if they're not, it's that, well, no matter, we know that women are great, but no matter what, other people are always going to hate us, and there's no way to get away from it. Which is like, how do you get up in the morning and feel like you can strive for life with that cloud over you?
Yeah.
Let alone,
I mean,
treat other people well and be a community with the whole world. If you're like, well, secretly they do hate me.
Yeah, I mean, it creates this incredibly traumatized, paranoid, isolated worldview. Naomi Klein writes in Doppelganger about how like so much of what Holocaust education in Jewish communities has done, instead of like remembering, instead of allowing people to kind of put the pieces of their lives back together after experiencing such trauma, instead of that, we just get re-traumatization, right?
Yeah.
Putting people, you're always one step away from Auschwitz. And that's what so much of the Israeli PR around October 7th has done, which is just like the Holocaust is right back here, and the Holocaust is one more step away if we don't keep fighting.
Can I ask you, Simone, about your own, because I know Israelism tracks this, about like your own kind of awakening around all the propaganda that you were told as a kid. And also ostensibly, if this were genocide were happening while you were like on Berkeley's campus, you might have been that kid who gets lifted up onto, CNN or Fox News and says, I was aggressed upon by and I'm not trying to say that you were this kid, but I know you would speak out in support of Israel. And, but tell me how that, what actually helped you to understand the occupation and distance maybe your own Jewish identity from the state of Israel.
Yeah. Well, actually, unfortunately, I was that kid in a lot of ways. And, part of what the film does show is like I was involved in pro-Israel advocacy when I got to Berkeley. I felt deeply threatened by pro-Palestinian activism on my campus because I was told by everyone around me that like I was endangered by it. I think part of the whole way that kind of this propaganda works is that before you even understand the things you're fighting, you're told, not to trust other people, that you have to go fight, that you have to rebut everything they're saying. And, I feel very fortunate that part of that I was curious, right? That like the activism, the truth telling that I heard from my peers on campus did shock my conscience and did force me to ask a lot of hard questions. I feel very lucky there were a lot of people who then were willing to talk to me and engage the questions that I brought to them. And, you know, most crucially, you know, the question, the real core of the question that you asked is like, I had to face the Palestinian experience. In my upbringing, Palestinians did not exist except as this kind of like scary negative shadow, right? And I met Palestinian students. I, you know, went to Israel Palestine, saw the reality of the occupation with my own eyes, began to read, began to learn. And like once you actually have to consider the Palestinian experience in its fullness, the whole narrative just comes apart so quickly. And you know, I just want to say one other thing about the college student, which is that, you know, at Columbia, there was this letter from pro-Israel students on campus, and they titled it "In My Name," which is a fascinating response to the "Not in My Name" campaign of you know, many left-wing anti-Zionist Jews. They're saying, "In our name, how dare you, you know, speak out against Israel? We support Israel." This like essentially like claiming the war on Gaza as something they do want in their names. And I just can't help but I felt so much sadness for those students, because I think my freshman year of college, I might have signed one of those letters before I understood, right? Like what I was being asked to sign on to, because you're in the hysteria. And it wasn't until I really like had the space to sit and think and process that my journey began. And I am certain that so many of those students who sign that letter, as they take time away from what they have experienced on campus, I can guarantee you that a lot of them are gonna have political awakenings. And it's really, it's not to excuse their involvement, you know, in supporting the repression of their peers, you know, who were leading the encampments. It's not to excuse anything that they are a part of. And I do also feel sadness and compassion for young people who get conscripted into these things before they really understand what they're doing.
Absolutely. I mean, and it happens. There's so many different, like, I don't know, I feel for young Republicans kind of, because their parents like indoctrinated them, you know?
Well, I mean, I would say, I think it's one of the things that I've learned going through all of this is that it's so deep with Jewish people. Like my Jewish friends growing up, they would go to yeshiva, and I figured they were learning, I don't know, Hebrew letters. And it turns out they were learning a lot of stuff that I had no idea about, even some of these things. And I think a lot of America did not know that there was a whole other set of history that people were being taught by the people that within their culture they're taught to think are the most trustworthy and wise, that these are the people you go to for answers. And like you were saying, they're specifically teaching Israel has to be protected and we are always going to be hunted by everybody who's not a part of that.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah, just to say one thing, like you definitely, if you go to yeshiva, do also learn a lot of things about Jewish tradition and texts that have nothing to do with Israel. And you know,
I know
at the Jewish school that I went to,
some sort of weird indoctrination place. I'm just saying, like, there's like a lot of different levels of teaching that's not just in their family. It's like structural too, correct?
oh yeah, I mean, it was like, it was my teachers at my school who, when they heard I was going to Berkeley, were like, oh, they hate Israel there. You have to go fight, right? Like that's just kind of like, that's part of the,
and
it's just in the water.
And as an 17, 18-year-old, that is so much to take on, right? But I do really love that you're saying to have compassion for these students, for, you know, and knowing that some of them, especially given that they're off campus now, may be having some awakening. And I am curious, because we talked about there's this interesting political huge divide between Israel proper and Jews worldwide, and American Jews specifically. But what I've heard from talking to Matt and whatnot is that in Israel, a lot of the liberal Israelis have left. They're gone. A lot of them have moved to, apparently Berlin is like, a lot of Israelis are like, peace, like, do not want to be part of this. Obviously, we know there's been protests against Netanyahu, but also it is a very, you know, if we think this United States is corrupt, right? I mean, Israel's got us beat tenfold. It's difficult. The Israeli left is small. And then in this country, there's also, I think, an awakening with, that's why I was curious about like whether there's more members joining If Not Now, or curious, or whether your workshops are like being attended, or like what that has looked like. Maybe, I don't know if you have thoughts about what's going on in Israel as well. But yeah, just take that however you want.
Yeah, I think I would say that it's not the rightward shift in Israel is dramatic and is incomparable, frankly, to what's right. Like in some ways, American Jewry overall is moving left, while or at least the younger generation, right, while the younger generation in Israel is moving to the right.
Yeah.
And there, there is a radical left. There are people who are trying to speak hard truths in their society. There are young people who are refusing military service, sitting in prison right now, right? And those people are incredibly small and marginal. And right. I was thinking, The Guardian published an article today by the Israeli Holocaust scholar Omer Bartov. He's a very respected historian of the Holocaust. And he wrote this really devastating piece about his last visit back to Israel, where he sat with a group of young people at an Israeli university who had served in Gaza and were just like irate that he had written publicly that Israel could be committing a genocide, and they were banging on the walls of the building, like screaming, until he finally invited them in for a dialogue. And he just writes about how startling it is to confront this society that is so insular and is so deeply steeped both in its own narrative of victimhood, but also in the deep dehumanization of Palestinians, that they just first of all, they barely see, right, what's happening in Gaza. This is part of what we hear. Like, Israeli media does not show any of the realities of the destruction. They don't know about the destroyed schools and hospitals, right? Like, they just think it's all propaganda. And what do you do with a society that is that deep in its own isolation from reality? It's very scary, and it's very,
and so armed and so militarized.
Yeah, also like Zateo just last week produced this documentary about also like investigating kind of this genocidal animus that has taken over Israeli society. And I think it's just very clear that the longer there is no accountability, the longer none of these people, these military leaders are held accountable for their war crimes and incitement to genocide, is the worse it gets. Yeah. And young people, again, like, part of what Omer Bartov says is like, the young people are saying these things because they're hearing it from their military commanders, right? So of course everybody is like, it's coming from the top down.
Yeah. No, and it's it's just wild. Like, and you do feel like, I've heard folks say, like, obviously change, if we're gonna create change, we're gonna end the occupation, if there is gonna be any kind of, in my opinion, one state solution, it has to come from within. But at the same time, there's not very many partners within Israel. Like, in my opinion, and God, we do not have a leg to stand on as the United States. But fuck, if we actually applied international law equally, I'm like, this is a job for an international body to demilitarize, and in terms of settlements, removing them. Yes. In terms of changing military culture. Once again, the United States not wants to talk, but fuck, maybe South Africa, maybe Japan post World War II. Like, who knows? But like, the ways that this will not, like, when you see torturers going on television justifying them raping a prisoner, you're like, oh, I'm not saying, and this is what my hope is that this does not happen by war, that this happens by some kind of treaty, that this happens by international law.
Yeah, I think that, the footage of the riots outside of the torture camps, and, in the last 2 weeks or so, right, we've seen not just Israeli politicians saying on television, that raping a prisoner is justified, B'Tselem, Israel's leading human rights organization, basically published this 100-page report that confirmed what Palestinians have been saying for months, which is that Israel's operating this network of torture camps where they're just committing unspeakable acts of depravity and violence against Palestinian detainees. I could say for myself personally, that was definitely like this, just facing that has been such another point of like rupture and no return of like how deep this brutality is. And I'm really scared about the fact that the US government refuses to hold Israel accountable for this. And the fact that we keep, like, every day that we send them more weapons is another day that this is allowed not just to continue, but to get even worse, because they are so emboldened by their impunity. And,
Yes.
and now they're like, trying to incite a regional war also, again, to fortify their impunity and to ensure that, like, nobody can talk about what's happening in Gaza. The US sends even more weapons. And it just feels like without anybody putting their foot on the brakes and stopping this, I feel like, back to the original point, like I feel really terrified about what that portends for the future of all the people that I care about who live in that land. No Israeli is safer living in this country that has spiraled out of control in this way, and that is such an antagonist to like every country around it in the region. And of course, every single day that this continues, we're just is another day that the level of destruction in Gaza is so devastating and so irreversible. I mean, it's like, every 1,000-ton bomb that is dropped is like many more years of rebuilding that is going to have to happen. And we don't even know how many people are dead at this point. And it's just, it's so scary. It's so devastating. And I think people are right to be protesting Kamala.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.